one of the most difficult audiences to speak in front of, in my experience, is students. Having made the documentary Lady Wrestler about the history of Black women in professional wrestling, I've gotten invitations to speak at schools over the years. Have you ever been in a position where you had to speak at a meeting at work, make a toast at a wedding or a birthday party? This is the second in a two-part video series with tips to help you with public speaking, based on my experience of promoting my books, movies, and other projects over the years. When you're invited to give a speech or just asked to say a few words, sometimes the person or the organization who invited you to speak will give you a time limit. I've even seen speakers at funerals being given a 2 to 5 minute time limit to speak. And that's understandable because a lot of times people will get up and ramble because trying to encapsulate someone's entire life in one speech is next to impossible. When I'm given a speech and I'm given a timeline, or I just know that maybe it's a school or college that I'm speaking at and the class only lasts for like maybe a half an hour or 40 to 45 minutes, what I do is I Google how many words are in a minute. And that gives me a guideline on how many words I have to write for my speech. And for the record, according to Google, about 130 words make up 1 minute of speaking. So that's one step in drafting a speech. It also helps to look up what is the traditional format of a speech. The traditional format is the opening, the body of the speech, which has the majority of the details you'll share, and then a closing. Following these guidelines can give you a format to work with as well. Once you've drafted your speech, there are a few different approaches to delivering the speech. One approach is to read word for word from a script. You would be surprised at how many highly accomplished, highly professional, and highly paid people who speak in front of big audiences all the time do this. They read from a script verbatim. A lot of times when you see politicians giving speeches, you'll see little screens on either side of the podium, and those screens may look like bulletproof shields, but actually what they are is teleprompters with the politician's speech. Also, a lot of public speakers tend to use note cards or actually paper that they've printed their speech out on. And I've seen even highly accomplished, very confident people lose their place in their script and kind of just go off the rails when they have trouble organizing their note cards or their paper. And they just completely not only lose their place in the script, but they lose the audience as well while they're fumbling with their note cards and their papers. In fairness, some people are good at improvising and joking about the fact that they've lost their place and kind of finding their way back. But not everyone is good at improvising or not panicking and not letting the audience know that they've lost their place. So, a tip that may seem pretty obvious, but not everyone follows this, is if you're going to speak from note cards or some kind of printed script or paper, you should number the note cards and the paper so that if your script gets out of order, you can easily find your place if you get off track. And if you're using a teleprompter, it's probably a good idea to have a printed script as a backup because I've seen teleprompters malfunction. Sometimes that happens at big award shows like the Oscars or the Emmys, and even professional actors who are paid to memorize lines for a living, even they can get off track and kind of get nervous if the teleprompter malfunctions. I'm not putting anyone down who reads from a script or note cards. I'm just saying that is simply one approach to giving a speech. Some people are better than others at reading from a script and making it sound natural and engaging. But for other people, the audience can tell they're reading and it sounds pretty dry. Some public speakers, even when they're reading from a script, they put enough inflection in their voice and they do what I call enough of a performance to keep the audience engaged and they make it entertaining and fun. Another approach to delivering a speech is to simply make bullet points of the main themes you want to hit and to speak off the cuff and use the bullet points just as a guide. Something that I find effective that I've learned through trial and error is a kind of hybrid approach. When I'm giving a presentation, what I do is I write out a script and I memorize little parts of it. And then when I deliver those lines, I don't say them word for word. I kind of improvise, but I have the lines in my head to guide me. It sounds contradictory, but writing out a script gives me the space to improvise and to ad lib. I think of it like jazz. Jazz musicians master their instruments and they learn the sheet music and they rehearse and they rehearse. So when they get on stage, it's more of a free-flowing kind of jam session rather than a strict, rigid performance that is note for note from the sheet music. And that is actually the approach I take in recording YouTube videos. Speaking off the top of my head without using a lot of filler words like, so, and is not one of my strong suits, but I'm confident enough to say that writing is one of my strong suits. When I'm making a YouTube video, I first write out a script. And when I'm recording the video, I look at the script between takes and I memorize little sections of it, anywhere from one line to a whole paragraph. But when I'm saying the lines, I don't say them word for word. I kind of just deliver the gist of what I had written on the page, but I don't stick to it verbatim. And while I change a word here and there, having that script written ahead of time keeps me from going off the rails, and it keeps me from using a lot of filler words that would bore the viewer, because that's exactly what would happen if I just decided to just turn the camera on and speak off the top of my head. That is just not a skill I have acquired yet in my life. That's one little hack that I use that maybe you can use if you're doing a pre-recorded presentation. Making YouTube videos, I've experimented with different things over the years. I've tried teleprompter apps, and I actually have a teleprompter app that works relatively well. But the catch is that I have to use this certain camera that is clunky and time consuming to set up. And setting up that camera and the tripod and all of that, it just is really not worth the time it takes. I've also tried teleprompter apps for my phone and tablet and laptop, and I don't know if it's just me if I'm doing something wrong, but every teleprompter app I've used, I can always tell looking back at the video that I'm reading from a script, because I can tell that my eyes are like scanning the screen, and I assume that the viewer will be able to tell as well. And I don't want to use AI to correct my eyes and make my eyes look like they're looking at the camera the whole time, because there are apps that can do that. And just personally, I feel that is deceptive to the viewer. And I'm not opposed to AI in general. I just don't want to use it for that purpose, because I'd rather kind of do my own work. Another tip I'd like to give for making speeches is how to speak in front of difficult audiences. And one of the most difficult audiences to speak in front of, in my experience, is students. Having made the documentary Lady Wrestler about the history of Black women in professional wrestling, I've gotten invitations to speak at schools over the years, and I also volunteer for an organization where I speak at elementary, middle, and high schools about careers in journalism, writing, and filmmaking. I found that the attention span of students depends on their age and their energy level. I often find that the teacher sets the tone for my presentation. My presentations usually go very well when the teacher gets up in front of the class before I speak and says, "Hey, this is our guest speaker for the day. Please sit up and give him your full attention." And what really keeps the student engaged is if the teacher passes out questions for the students to ask me during my presentation. And if they get extra credit for asking questions, I find that the students are really engaged because they're focused on getting extra credit, getting those points, and they're not just zoning out or putting their head down on the desk, which has happened to me from time to time while I've been speaking. And that kind of raises the point that students are sometimes a difficult audience to speak in front of, but students, young people, are also a good audience if you're trying to improve your presentation skills, because a lot of them have not yet developed those social niceties where they try not to hurt your feelings. They can be brutally honest, and finding out what works and what doesn't work in front of young people can really kind of sharpen your public speaking skills. Based on my personal experience, a tip I would offer for speaking to young people is to speak with them and not at them. In other words, speaking in front of a class of young people would not be a good time to read word for word from a printed speech. When I speak to students, I try to put myself in their shoes. And I know as a kid, if someone had come and spoken to my class and they were reading word for word from a speech, unless they were a very good performer, as I mentioned before, someone who knows how to put inflection in their voice even when they're reading, that would bore me to tears. When I'm speaking to students, I will take the bullet points approach. I'll write bullet points down on note cards, and I will speak off the top of my head. And even though I do have a tendency to use a lot of filler words, I find that when I'm speaking to students, it becomes more of a conversation if I ask them questions while I'm presenting. For example, if I'm talking at a school about careers and how to enter the workforce and how to get your first job, I'll say, my first job was as a busboy at a restaurant called Damon's. Does anyone know what a busboy is? So, what I'm doing, instead of just explaining right away what a busboy is and what I did in my first job, I pull the students in, I try to engage them by asking questions and also walking around the room and not just staying static in one place. Another tip is to treat pop culture references like the young people have never heard them before. I'm Generation X, and a generational difference I've noticed with young people today is that they don't have the pop culture references of their parents and grandparents like I did when I was growing up. When I was growing up, I was more familiar with the television shows, the movies, the music that my parents and grandparents were into because there were reruns of old movies and old TV shows on TV when I was growing up. And there were also commercials like those old Time Life anthologies for music from the 60s and even sometimes before the 60s, like music that was popular when my parents and grandparents were growing up, like the big band sound. So just through sheer exposure, I knew what my parents and grandparents watched on TV, the movies they went and saw, and the music that they listened to. It is a totally different world with young people today. When I was growing up, there was what was known as monoculture. There were only a few, maybe three or four local TV stations. There was the radio, but there weren't dozens of radio stations. There were a handful of radio stations. And there wasn't all the social media apps to scroll through, and YouTube didn't even exist. So there was less competition for attention, and pretty much everyone knew the same TV shows, the same music, and the same even commercials. From speaking at schools, I've learned that a lot of young people will not necessarily know a pop culture reference from my childhood unless it's something huge like Michael Jackson or the Beatles. And even then, sometimes it can be questionable. And they may not even know a pop culture reference from recent history, like 5, 10, or 20 years ago. It's ironic that young people have literally pretty much every piece of pop culture that has been released over the past century at their fingertips through the internet. But society now is just sort of ahistorical. Pop culture is just sort of disposable, and people only are really kind of enthusiastic about things that are very, very recent. For example, I was recently speaking at a school's career day, and I was speaking about how I got into writing and filmmaking and journalism and who inspired me when I was growing up. And I mentioned Oprah Winfrey. These fourth graders did not even know who Oprah Winfrey was, or is, I should say. Oprah, of course, is still very relevant. She's very much still a media mogul, but she's not in everyone's living room like she was when I was growing up. So I would suggest when you're talking to young people, just assume they're not going to know what a pop culture reference is if it's older than 5 years. It's better to over explain than to assume that they know something and have them looking at you with blank expressions when you drop a name like Oprah Winfrey that you assume that everyone, regardless of age, should know. And when I say over explain, I don't mean go into extraneous detail because that can become tedious and bore kids as well. What I mean is give context or some kind of background about the pop culture reference you're making and why it's relevant. For example, I explained to the children, well, Oprah Winfrey was a very famous journalist. She was one of the first black female billionaires, and she inspired me with her entrepreneurship and how she set an example on how black people could own their own media companies. Give just enough of an explanation and context to help the young people understand what the pop culture reference is that you're making. Also, avoid talking about anything that is too conceptual with young children. For example, at the school I spoke at recently, I was talking about how learning another language can make you more employable. I talked about how I'm learning Spanish and how I not only take Spanish lessons, but I also listen to podcasts in English by people who are Latino talking about Latin American culture because I learn things that I would not learn from just a simple language lesson. And I gave the example of someone who is learning English may not necessarily understand the phrase cutting off your nose to spite your face because it's not meant literally, it's a metaphor. Or I actually asked the students, does anyone want to take a guess at what that American colloquialism means? And it just went way over their heads. They were like, oh, do you mean you literally take a knife and cut your nose off? It was a concept that was just too broad and too abstract for fourth graders. Learn from my mistake, and when talking to young people, keep it basic and simple. Those are my tips to help you with public speaking. As I mentioned, this is the second in a two-part video, and I'll put the link to the first video in the description box of this video. I hope you found these tips helpful. Thank you for watching. Oh, and one more thing. Sometimes you can't tell how an audience is receiving you and your message while you're in the middle of delivering your speech. The speaking engagement where I tried to explain the colloquialism, cutting off your nose to spite your face, I thought I had lost the students. But at the end of the presentation, the students came up, all of them, and asked me for my autograph, and they seemed very enthusiastic about meeting me. I share that with you to encourage you to do your best, seek feedback about your presentation, and use it to improve going forward. But at some point, you just have to rest assured that you have done your best, and how people receive you and your message is not necessarily in your control. And maybe, just maybe, your presentation might get a positive reception that you totally weren't expecting. If you like this video, please leave a comment, share it, and subscribe to my channel.